At least, I don't think I was. The speedometer on my '98 Honda had been acting up for months, the needle jumping between 40 and 70 like it couldn't make up its mind. But the roads were empty at this hour, nearly midnight in some small town whose name I'd already forgotten, and I'd been driving for 3 hours without seeing another car. Just me, the broken yellow lines, and the kind of darkness that only exists in places where people actually sleep at night. I should have been sleeping too. Should have been home in my apartment in Portland, dealing with the boxes of David's things still stacked in the corner of the bedroom, still waiting for him to come pick them up. Should have been doing a lot of things differently, probably. But instead I was here, wherever here was, driving through the kind of town that exists solely to give travelers a place to buy gas and wonder what they're doing with their lives. The red and blue lights in my rearview mirror came from nowhere. 1 second the road behind me was empty, the next it was all flashing colors and the sudden understanding that my night was about to get complicated in ways I wasn't prepared for. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, my heart doing that thing it does when you're caught doing something you weren't even aware you were doing. The engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound in the world except for the low hum of the patrol car's engine behind me. I could see the officer's silhouette in my side mirror, tall, broad shoulders, taking his time getting out of the car like he had all night to kill. Maybe he did. I rolled down my window and waited, hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel like they teach you in driver's ed, back when the world made more sense and I thought I knew where I was going. The air that drifted in was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine trees and something else, wood smoke maybe, from someone's late-night fire. It smelled like the kind of place where people still looked at stars instead of their phones. The officer's footsteps crunched on gravel as he approached, slow and deliberate. No hurry, no urgency, just the measured pace of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before and knew exactly how it would go. Except it didn't go how I expected. "Evening," he said, and his voice was lower than I'd anticipated, rougher around the edges in a way that suggested too much coffee and not enough sleep. "License and registration, please." I fumbled for my wallet, fingers clumsy with exhaustion and something that might have been nerves. Was I speeding? My speedometer's been acting up, so I honestly don't know. He took my license when I handed it to him, but instead of the quick glance I expected, he studied it, really looked at it like it might contain answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. "Oregon," he said, not really a question. "Long way from home." "Yeah." I waited for him to ask me the usual questions, where I'd been, where I was going, why I was driving through his town at midnight on a Tuesday, but he didn't. Instead, he handed my license back and leaned against my car, one elbow resting on the roof, like we were old friends having a conversation in a parking lot instead of a traffic stop on an empty highway. "You always drive this late?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. Not because it was unusual, cops probably ask that sort of thing all the time, but because of the way he asked it. Like he genuinely wanted to know the answer, like my answer mattered to him in some way that had nothing to do with whether or not he was going to write me a ticket. "Not usually," I said, and then, surprising myself, added, "Tonight's been different." He nodded like that made perfect sense, which it didn't. Nothing about tonight made sense, least of all why I was sitting here talking to a stranger in uniform about my driving habits when I should have been making excuses and apologizing for whatever traffic violation had brought us together. Different how? I should have deflected. Should have given him some generic answer about work or family or any of the dozen polite lies people tell to avoid real conversation with strangers. Instead, I heard myself saying, I needed to drive somewhere, anywhere, so I did. He was quiet for a long moment, and in the silence I became aware of other sounds. The distant hum of the highway, the rustle of wind through trees I couldn't see, the faint crackle of his radio. But mostly I was aware of his presence beside my car, solid and calm and somehow not threatening at all. "You okay?" he asked finally. The question was so simple, so unexpected that for a second I forgot how to breathe. When was the last time someone had asked me that? Really asked, not as a greeting or pleasantry, but as an actual question with space for an actual answer? I don't know, I said, because it was the truth and because something about the darkness and his quiet voice made lying seem impossible. Probably not. He didn't respond right away, and when I glanced up at him, I could see his profile in the glow from his patrol car's headlights. Sharp jawline, serious eyes, the kind of face that belonged on someone who'd seen things but hadn't let them break him. He looked like he was thinking, weighing something in his mind. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mark." I paused. "Mark Henley." "I'm Jake," he said, and there was something about the way he said it. No last name, no title, just Jake. That shifted the entire dynamic between us. Like we'd stepped out of our roles somehow, stopped being officer and driver and become just two people talking in the middle of the night. "Nice to meet you, Jake." "You too, Mark." Another silence, but this one felt different. Comfortable somehow, like we were friends who'd run into each other unexpectedly and were catching up, taking our time because neither of us had anywhere else to be. He didn't ask for my registration. He didn't ask where I'd been drinking or whether I had any weapons in the car. He asked how I was, and when I couldn't give him a good answer, he just stood there like that was okay too. "You married, Mark?" he asked eventually. "Was," I said. "Ended about 6 months ago." "Sorry to hear that." "Yeah, well," I shrugged, though he probably couldn't see it in the darkness. "These things happen, right?" "Do they?" The question surprised me. Most people, when you mention a breakup or divorce, nod sympathetically and change the subject or launch into their own relationship horror stories. They don't ask follow-up questions. They don't make you examine whether the thing that happened to you was really inevitable or if it was something else entirely. "I thought they did," I said slowly. "I thought that's just how it went. You meet someone, you fall in love, you build a life together, and then one day you wake up and realize you're strangers living in the same space, going through the motions because you don't know how to stop." Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, like he was sharing a secret. "That's not how it has to go." "No?" "No." I wanted to ask him how he knew, whether he was speaking from experience or just optimism. But something in his tone suggested the conversation had moved into territory that was more personal than either of us had intended. So instead, I sat there, listening to the night sounds and trying to figure out why I felt more relaxed talking to this stranger in uniform than I had in months of trying to have real conversations with David. "You know what's funny?" I said after a while. "What's that?" "I was thinking earlier, before you pulled me over, about how I don't know where I'm going anymore. Not just tonight, but in general. Like I've been driving for hours and I couldn't tell you my destination if my life depended on it. Maybe that's not a bad thing." I looked up at him, surprised. "Being lost? Being open to ending up somewhere you didn't plan to be?" There was something in the way he said it that made me think he wasn't just talking about geography. Something that made me wonder if he spent his nights patrolling these empty roads not just because it was his job, but because he understood the pull of movement without direction, the comfort of being in transit between one life and the next. "Have you ever done that?" I asked. "Just driven somewhere without knowing why?" "More than I probably should." "And where do you usually end up?" He smiled then, and even in the dim light I could see it was the kind of smile that carried weight, like it didn't come easily but meant something when it did. "Here," he said simply. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. We stood there, him leaning against my car, me still sitting behind the wheel, and let the silence stretch between us. It should have been awkward. It should have been the kind of pause that makes you scramble for something to fill it with. But it wasn't. It was the kind of silence that happens between people who recognize something in each other, even if they can't name what it is yet. Finally, Jake straightened up and took a step back from my car. For a moment, I thought he was going to end this, whatever this was, and send me on my way with a warning or a ticket, or just the memory of a strange encounter on a lonely road. But instead of walking back to his patrol car, he crouched down beside my open window, bringing himself to my eye level. "You can go," he said quietly, "or you can stay. Up to you." The words hung in the air between us, loaded with possibility and implication, and a dozen different meanings I wasn't sure I was ready to unpack. This wasn't how traffic stops went. This wasn't how any of this was supposed to work. But then again, nothing about tonight was following the script I thought I knew. I should have thanked him and driven away. Should have put this strange encounter behind me and gotten back to the business of figuring out my life without the complication of a late-night conversation with a cop whose eyes seemed to see more than they should. Should have done the smart thing, the safe thing, the thing that made sense. Instead, I heard myself asking, "Is there a gas station around here?" "About a mile up the road, Shell Station. They've got decent coffee if you don't mind it being a few hours old." "Thanks." I started to roll up my window, but his hand caught the edge of it, gentle but firm. "Mark?" "Yeah?" "Drive careful." There was something in the way he said it, not the standard cop farewell, but something more personal, more concerned, that made my chest tight in a way I couldn't explain. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and he stepped back, letting me pull away from the shoulder and back onto the empty highway. In my rearview mirror, I watched him walk back to his patrol car, his movements unhurried and deliberate. He didn't get in right away. Instead, he stood beside the driver's door for a moment, looking down the road in the direction I'd gone, like he was thinking about something, or maybe just thinking. The Shell station appeared exactly where he'd said it would, a bright oasis of fluorescent light in the darkness. I pulled up to the pumps even though my tank was three-quarters full, suddenly needing the excuse to stop, to breathe, to process whatever had just happened back there on the highway. The attendant inside looked barely out of high school, all acne and eager helpfulness, the kind of kid who probably thought working the night shift at a gas station was an adventure instead of a sentence. I bought a cup of coffee that smelled like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration, and a package of stale donuts I didn't want, just because standing in the Too Bright store felt better than sitting alone in my car trying to make sense of the last 20 minutes. "You're not from around here," the kid said as he rang me up, not a question. "Just passing through." "Most people are. Don't get a lot of folks who stop unless they need gas or directions." He handed me my change. "You need directions?" I almost said no, almost kept up the pretense that I knew where I was going and why. But something about the kid's open face and the surreal nature of the entire evening made honesty seem like the only option. "I don't think so," I said. "I don't really know where I'm headed." He nodded like that was the most natural thing in the world. "Sometimes that's the best way to travel. My mom always says you can't get lost if you don't know where you're supposed to be." Smart mom, I thought, but before I could say so, the bell above the door chimed and another customer walked in. I glanced over automatically and felt my breath catch. Jake. He'd changed out of his uniform, or maybe he'd been wearing civilian clothes under his jacket all along, and in jeans and a plain gray t-shirt he looked different. Younger, somehow. Less official, more like someone I might have met in a coffee shop or bookstore, someone I might have noticed and wondered about. He saw me immediately, our eyes meeting across the small store, and for a second neither of us moved. Then he walked over to the coffee station, his movements casual and unhurried, like running into me here was the most natural thing in the world. "How's the coffee?" he asked, pumping a cup full of the same questionable brew I was holding. "Terrible," I said honestly. "Good. I'd hate to think I was missing out on something." We stood there by the coffee station, two grown men making small talk about bad gas station coffee like we were old friends meeting for their weekly catch-up. But underneath the casual conversation, I could feel something else, a current of tension or possibility or simple human connection that made the fluorescent light seem less harsh and the late hour less lonely. "You following me, officer?" I asked, trying for light and playful but hearing the uncertainty in my own voice. "It's Jake," he said quietly. "And maybe I am." The honesty in his answer caught me off guard again. No deflection, no joke to cover the weight of what he'd just admitted. Just the simple truth that he'd come here because I was here, that whatever had started back on the highway wasn't finished yet. "Why?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, stirring sugar into his coffee with more attention than the task required. When he looked up at me again, his eyes were serious, thoughtful. "You looked like you needed someone to talk to." It was such a simple statement, such a basic human kindness, but it hit me harder than it should have. When was the last time someone had seen me, really seen me, and responded not with advice or judgment or their own agenda, but with simple presence? When was the last time someone had offered to just be there, no strings attached? And you? I asked. Do you need someone to talk to? He smiled then, that same weighted smile I'd seen by the side of the road. Maybe I do. The kid behind the counter was watching us with a kind of fascination that comes from working night shifts in a small town where nothing ever happens and suddenly something interesting is unfolding right in front of you. I caught his eye and nodded toward the door. Want to take this outside? I asked Jake. Sure. We paid for our terrible coffee and walked out into the night. The air was cooler now, carrying the promise of dawn still hours away, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, even if I couldn't have explained why. There was a concrete curb that ran along the front of the gas station, separating the parking lot from a strip of grass that probably looked better in daylight. We sat down on it without discussing it. Two men in their 30s drinking bad coffee outside a Shell station at nearly 2 in the morning, like it was the most normal thing in the world. So, I said after we'd been sitting in comfortable silence for a few minutes, this isn't how these things usually go. No, Jake said softly. It's not. Another silence, but this one felt charged with possibility, like we were standing at the edge of something neither of us fully understood, but both of us were curious about. I don't usually talk to people like this, Jake said eventually. Off duty, I mean. I looked at him, noting the careful way he'd phrased it. But you're still on duty. Not really. Our eyes met in the harsh glow of the gas station lights, and I felt something shift between us, something that had been building since he'd first leaned against my car and asked me if I was okay. Something that felt dangerous and safe at the same time, like standing at the edge of a cliff and discovering you could fly. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. We just sat there, two strangers who weren't quite strangers anymore, drinking terrible coffee and breathing the same cool night air and trying to figure out what happened next. I didn't know what happened next. I didn't know why I'd stopped here, why he'd followed me, why we were sitting together like old friends when we'd met less than an hour ago. I didn't know what any of it meant, or where it was leading, or whether I was making the biggest mistake of my life or the best decision I'd had in years. All I knew was that for the first time in months, I didn't feel lost. I felt found. The realization should have scared me, should have sent me running back to my car and the safety of the highway and the familiar territory of not knowing what I wanted. But it didn't. Instead, it settled into my chest like something that had been waiting there all along, patient and quiet and sure. Jake finished his coffee and set the empty cup on the ground beside him. In the distance, I could hear the low rumble of a truck on the highway, some other late-night traveler making their way through the darkness toward whatever destination called to them. But the sound felt far away, like it belonged to a different world than this one we'd created here on the curb of a gas station in the middle of nowhere. What happens now? I asked, not because I needed an answer, but because the silence was becoming too heavy to carry alone. Jake looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the same uncertainty I felt, the same sense of standing at the beginning of something that could change everything or nothing at all. I don't know, he said simply. It wasn't the answer I'd expected, but it was the one I needed, because knowing would have made this ordinary, would have given us a script to follow and roles to play. Not knowing meant we got to figure it out as we went, meant we got to write our own story without worrying about how it was supposed to end. I leaned back against the concrete wall behind me and looked up at the sky. There were more stars here than I ever saw in the city, scattered across the darkness like possibilities waiting to be explored. I should probably get going, I said, but I didn't move. Probably, Jake agreed, but he didn't move either. We sat there for another few minutes, neither of us willing to be the one to end whatever this was. Finally, Jake stood up and extended his hand to help me up. His grip was warm and steady, and he held on for just a moment longer than necessary before letting go. "Drive safe, Mark," he said. "I will." I walked toward my car, keys already in my hand, ready to get back on the highway and continue the drive that had brought me here. But when I reached the driver's door, I turned back. Jake was still standing by the curb, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Jake?" I called out. "Yeah? Thank you for tonight. For—" I gestured vaguely, trying to encompass everything that had happened between us. "For seeing me." He nodded slowly, understanding exactly what I meant. "Thank you for letting me." I got in my car and started the engine, but I didn't drive away immediately. Instead, I sat there for a moment, looking at this man who'd appeared in my rearview mirror like an answer to a question I hadn't known I was asking. He raised his hand in a small wave, and I waved back, and then I put the car in drive and pulled out of the gas station parking lot. In my rearview mirror, I watched him get smaller and smaller until he disappeared entirely, swallowed by the darkness and distance. But the feeling he'd given me, the sense of being seen, of being understood, of being exactly where I needed to be, that stayed with me as I drove through the night toward whatever came next. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know if I'd ever see Jake again. Didn't know if tonight had been a beginning or just a beautiful interruption in the middle of a life that was still figuring itself out. But I knew something had changed. Something had shifted in the space between meeting his eyes and saying goodbye. Something that made the road ahead feel less empty and more full of possibility. And for now, that was enough. Part 2, except I didn't drive away. I sat there in my idling car looking at Jake through the windshield, and something in his posture, the way he stood with his hands in his pockets, patient and unhurried, made me turn off the engine. "Having second thoughts?" he asked when I got back out. "Maybe," I said honestly. "Or first thoughts. I'm not sure I've been thinking clearly about anything lately." Jake nodded like that made perfect sense. "Mind if I ask what you're second thinking about?" I looked around at the empty parking lot, the harsh fluorescent lights, the profound stillness of a world that had gone to sleep hours ago. "This," I said finally. "Tonight. The fact that I don't want it to end yet." "Why do you think that is?" It was such a therapist question, so gentle and probing that I almost smiled. "Are you always this good at getting people to talk?" "Occupational hazard," he said, but there was warmth in it. "People tell cops things, usually things they probably shouldn't, but sometimes things they need to." "And which category do I fall into?" He considered this seriously, like it was a question that deserved a real answer. "I don't think you're the type to say things you shouldn't," he said finally. "I think you're the type to not say things you should." The observation was so accurate it made my chest tight. David had said something similar once during one of our last real fights. "You never tell me what you're actually thinking, Mark. You just disappear inside your own head and expect me to guess." "You don't know me well enough to say that," I said, but there was no heat in it. "Maybe not, but I know what I see." "And what do you see?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying my face in the unforgiving light. Someone who's been carrying something heavy for a long time. Someone who's forgotten what it feels like to put it down. I wanted to argue with him, to tell him he was wrong, that I was fine, that whatever he thought he saw was just the exhaustion of driving all night. But the words wouldn't come. Maybe because they would have been lies. Maybe because standing here with this stranger who saw too much felt safer than the truth I'd been running from. "What's your name?" I asked suddenly. "Your real name, I mean, not just Jake." Something shifted in his expression, like I'd asked for something more personal than I realized. "Eli," he said after a pause. "Jake's my middle name. Most people call me Officer Morrison, so—" "Eli," I repeated, testing the sound of it. It fit him better than Jake somehow. Less casual, more substantial. The kind of name that belonged to someone who worked night shifts and asked strangers if they were okay. "I'm Mark Henley." "I know," he said softly. "You told me. But this feels different now, more real." Eli nodded. "Names have weight." We stood there in the parking lot, two men who'd officially introduced themselves like we were at a business meeting instead of standing outside a gas station at 2 in the morning. But he was right. It did feel more real now, less like a chance encounter and more like the beginning of something, though I couldn't have said what. Are you tired? Eli asked. Not really. You? Night shift insomnia. I don't usually sleep until dawn anyway. He glanced around the empty lot. Want to walk? I should have said no. Should have gotten back in my car and found a motel room and tried to get a few hours of sleep before continuing whatever journey I was on. But the idea of being alone with my thoughts in some anonymous room felt impossibly heavy after the unexpected lightness of the last hour. Yeah, I said. I'd like that. We left our cars in the gas station lot and started walking down the main street of the town. It was the kind of place that probably bustled during the day. Small shops with hand-painted signs, a few restaurants with optimistic outdoor seating, the bones of a community that took care of itself. But at this hour it felt like a ghost town, all empty windows and sleeping dreams. How long have you lived here? I asked, as we passed a bookstore with a display of local authors in the window. 5 years, moved here from Seattle after. He paused, and I could feel him deciding how much to share. After my life got complicated in ways I didn't know how to handle. What kind of complicated? The kind where you wake up one day and realize the person you thought you were building a life with sees you completely differently than you see yourself. His voice was matter-of-fact, but I caught the edge of old hurt underneath. The kind where you spend 6 months in couples therapy trying to fix something that was broken from the beginning. I stopped walking. Eli took a few more steps before he noticed and turned back. What? He asked. Nothing, it's just... I shook my head. That sounds familiar. Does it? We started walking again, slower this time, like we both needed the movement to make this conversation possible. David and I were together for 4 years, I said. Lived together for 2. We had this whole plan, get married, buy a house, maybe adopt a kid eventually, the whole domestic dream. I kicked at a loose piece of concrete on the sidewalk, but somewhere along the way we stopped talking about what we actually wanted and started going through the motions of what we thought we should want. When did you realize? About 6 months ago. We were at his sister's wedding, watching her marry this guy she'd known for barely a year, and they looked at each other like they'd discovered fire. And I looked at David, and he looked at me, and we both knew we'd never looked at each other that way. Eli was quiet for a block before he spoke again. What happened then? Nothing dramatic. No big fight, no infidelity, no moment of clarity. We just stopped pretending it was working. He moved out 3 weeks later, very civilized, very adult. I laughed, but it came out bitter. Very fucking depressing. Is that why you were driving tonight? Partly. His stuff is still in boxes in my apartment. He was supposed to pick it up weeks ago, but he keeps rescheduling. I think we're both avoiding the finality of it. I glanced at Eli. So tonight I decided to avoid it literally. Just got in my car and drove until I couldn't think about cardboard boxes anymore. Did it work? I considered this. For about 3 hours, then you pulled me over. Sorry about that. Don't be. The words came out more earnest than I'd intended. I think I needed to be pulled over. I think I needed to stop running and just be somewhere for a while. We'd reached the end of the commercial district where the sidewalk gave way to residential streets lined with small houses and tall trees. A few early risers had lights on in their kitchens, the warm glow of morning routines beginning behind drawn curtains. It was the kind of neighborhood where people knew their neighbors' names and brought casseroles when someone was sick. It's nice here, I said. It is, quiet. People mostly mind their own business, but they show up when you need them to. Is that what you needed after Seattle? Eli nodded. I needed to remember who I was when nobody else was watching, when I wasn't trying to be the person someone else wanted me to be. And did you remember? He smiled, and in the soft light of the street lamps, it was the first truly relaxed expression I'd seen from him. I'm getting there. We turned a corner and found ourselves on a street that looked like it belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting. White picket fences, rose gardens, the kind of porch swings that suggested summer evenings and lemonade. It was almost aggressively wholesome. The kind of place that made city cynics roll their eyes and secretly wish they'd grown up somewhere exactly like it. "Do you miss it?" I asked. "Seattle?" "Sometimes. I miss the anonymity. The way you could disappear into 800,000 people and nobody expected you to wave at them in the grocery store." He gestured toward the sleeping houses around us. "But I don't miss the isolation. Turns out there's a difference between choosing to be alone and being lonely in a crowd." I knew exactly what he meant. Portland wasn't as big as Seattle, but it was big enough to feel lost in, big enough to spend weeks without having a real conversation with another human being, big enough to convince yourself that was normal. "I work nights by choice now," Eli said as we passed a house where someone was already up, the kitchen window glowing yellow against the pre-dawn darkness. "There's less noise, more quiet things to notice." "Like what?" "Like the way the world sounds different at 3 in the morning, like the fact that insomniacs and night shift workers and new parents are all awake at the same time, all dealing with their own version of the dark hours." He paused beside a street lamp that was flickering, its light cycling from bright to dim and back again. "Like the way some conversations can only happen when the rest of the world is asleep." The observations settled into the space between us, and I realized he was right. There was something about the late hour that made honesty easier, that stripped away the social niceties and performance anxiety that made daytime conversations feel like elaborate dances around what you actually wanted to say. "Is that what this is?" I asked. "One of those conversations?" "I think so." We stood under the flickering streetlight, and I found myself studying Eli's face properly for the first time. He was maybe a year or two older than me, with the kind of weathered good looks that suggested he'd spent time outdoors before becoming a cop. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of either laughter or squinting into too many sunrises, and a scar on his chin that was too faded to be recent. He looked like someone who'd lived enough life to have stories worth telling, but who was selective about who got to hear them. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Sure." "Why did you follow me here? To the gas station, I mean. You could have just let me drive away." Eli was quiet for so long that I started to think he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, more uncertain. "You looked like you needed someone to talk to," he said, echoing what he'd told me earlier. "But that's not the whole truth." "What's the whole truth?" "The whole truth is that I needed someone to talk to, too. I've been doing this job for 5 years, pulling people over, asking them where they're going and where they've been, and most of the time they lie to me or give me the answer they think I want to hear. But when you said you didn't know where you were going," he shrugged, "it was the most honest thing anyone said to me in months. So you followed me. So I followed you." I wanted to ask him what that meant, wanted to push for clarity about what was happening between us and where it might lead. But something about the way he'd admitted his own loneliness made me hold back. Some admissions deserve space to breathe before being dissected. "There's a diner about 2 blocks from here," Eli said eventually. "Opens at 4 for the early shift workers. Want to get some real coffee?" I checked my phone. It was 3:47 a.m. "Won't people think it's weird? A cop and a random guy having coffee at 4 in the morning?" "Probably, but I don't really care what people think anymore." There was something liberating about the way he said it, like he'd spent years worrying about other people's opinions and had finally decided it wasn't worth the energy. I wondered what that felt like, to move through the world without constantly calculating how you appeared to others. "Lead the way," I said. The diner was exactly what you'd expect from a place that opened before dawn in a small town. Red vinyl booths, a long counter with rotating stools, the smell of bacon grease and industrial-strength coffee. There were maybe half a dozen other customers scattered throughout, all of them looking like they'd either been up all night or gotten up way too early. Nobody looked at us twice when we walked in. We took a booth in the back, and a waitress who looked like she'd been working here since the Carter administration brought us coffee without being asked. The mugs were thick white ceramic, chipped around the edges but clean, and the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead. "Better?" Eli asked, wrapping his hands around his mug. "Much." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us seeming to savor the warmth of the coffee and the simple pleasure of being somewhere that felt removed from time. The diner existed in its own bubble, a place where 4 in the morning was just another hour and nobody questioned why you might need pie and coffee before the sun came up. What do you do? Eli asked eventually. For work, I mean. Graphic design, freelance mostly, corporate identity stuff, some web design. I took a sip of coffee. It's not exactly what I thought I'd be doing when I was 25, but it pays the bills and I can work from home. Do you like it? I considered this. It was such a simple question, but I realized I hadn't asked myself that in years. I'm good at it, I said finally. But I don't know if I like it. I used to draw for fun, like actual art, but somewhere along the way I stopped making time for that. Why? Life, I guess. Bills, David, the general conviction that being an adult means putting practical concerns ahead of things that make you happy. I laughed ruefully. Sounds pretty stupid when I say it out loud. Sounds familiar. What about you? Always wanted to be a cop? Eli shook his head. I was a social worker in Seattle, child protective services mostly, burned out after about 7 years. That must have been hard. It was, but it was also the most important work I've ever done. He stared into his coffee cup like it might contain answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. Some days you got to help kids who really needed it. Other days you had to take children away from parents who loved them but couldn't take care of them. And some days, he trailed off. Some days? Some days you didn't get there in time. The weight in his voice told me everything I needed to know about why he'd left Seattle, why he'd needed to find somewhere quiet to remember who he was. I'd never done work that carried that kind of responsibility, that kind of potential for both saving and failing people in ways that mattered. Is police work easier? I asked. Different. Less stakes, usually. Most of what I deal with here is drunk driving, domestic disputes, teenagers making poor choices, still helping people, but in smaller ways. He met my eyes across the table. Though sometimes you pull someone over and end up having the most interesting conversation you've had in months. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, surprised by how much his words affected me. Is that what this is? Interesting? Among other things. Before I could ask what other things he meant, the waitress appeared beside our table with a coffee pot and a knowing smile. You boys want some breakfast? Got fresh biscuits coming out of the oven. We ended up ordering eggs and bacon and those promised biscuits, partly because we were both hungry and partly because eating together felt like the natural next step in whatever progression we were following. The food was simple and good, the kind of meal that reminded you that some pleasures didn't need to be complicated. As we ate, the conversation drifted to easier topics, books we'd read, places we'd traveled, the strange comfort of being awake when most of the world was sleeping. Eli had read more philosophy than I would have expected, and I found myself recommending design blogs and art exhibitions with an enthusiasm I hadn't felt in months. People always want to be seen, he said at one point, apropos of nothing we'd been discussing, even if they don't know it. The comment came out of left field, but it hit something deep in my chest. What do you mean? I mean, most people are walking around feeling invisible, like they could disappear tomorrow and nobody would notice, like their thoughts and feelings and dreams don't matter to anyone else. He gestured vaguely toward the other customers in the diner. But they do matter. Everyone has something interesting about them if you bother to look. Is that why you became a social worker? Partly, but it's also why I like police work, even the boring parts. People call us when their lives are falling apart, when they need help or protection or just someone to listen. Most of the time we can't fix their problems, but we can see them. We can acknowledge that their pain is real and their fear is valid. I thought about this as I worked on my eggs. Do you think that's what happened tonight? You saw me? I think we saw each other. The simplicity of it, the idea that recognition could be mutual, that two strangers could meet in the middle of the night and suddenly feel less alone in the world, made something settle in my chest that I hadn't even realized was unsettled. I didn't know I was lonely, I said quietly. Until you sat down beside me, I didn't know I wanted to stay. Eli nodded like this made perfect sense to him. Loneliness is funny that way. You can get so used to it that you forget it's not natural. You start thinking isolation is just how life is. But it's not. Not if you don't want it to be. Outside the diner windows, the sky was starting to lighten at the edges, that deep blue that comes just before dawn. Soon the rest of the world would wake up, and this strange, suspended night would officially end. The thought should have been comforting. A return to normal life and regular schedules and the familiar rhythm of days that made sense. Instead, it filled me with something that felt like loss. "What time do you usually get off work?" I asked. "7, but I'm technically off duty now. Have been since about midnight." "So why are you still in uniform?" Eli looked down at his clothes like he'd forgotten what he was wearing. "Habit, I guess. Sometimes I patrol even when I'm not on the clock. Gives me something to do with the insomnia." "Don't you ever want to just go home? Watch TV, read a book, do normal off-duty things?" "What's normal?" he asked, but he was smiling. "Besides, my apartment gets pretty quiet. Sometimes driving around, being available if someone needs help feels more useful than sitting alone watching Netflix." I understood that impulse, the need to be useful when your own life felt stagnant or unclear. How many nights had I spent working on freelance projects I didn't need to finish, just to avoid sitting with my own thoughts? "Where do you live?" I asked. "About 10 minutes from here. Little place above the bookstore you probably saw when we were walking." He drained the last of his coffee. "What about you? Find a motel yet?" I hadn't, actually. I'd been so caught up in this unexpected encounter that I'd completely forgotten about practical concerns like sleep and shelter. I should probably figure that out soon. There's a decent place about 5 miles north of town. Clean, quiet. The kind of place where they don't ask too many questions. We sat in the diner until nearly 6, long past the point where we'd finished eating, just talking and drinking coffee and watching the sky grow lighter outside the windows. Other customers came and went, shift workers grabbing breakfast before heading to factories or construction sites, a few early-rising retirees who probably came here every morning for the social interaction as much as the coffee. But we stayed, neither of us seeming eager to break the spell of the night by admitting it was over. Finally, as the morning crowd started to thicken and our waitress began giving us looks that suggested our booth was needed for paying customers, Eli suggested we head out. "I can give you a ride back to your car," he said as we stood outside the diner, blinking in the pale morning light. "You don't have to do that." "I want to." The patrol car felt different in daylight, more official, more like a barrier between us and whatever connection we'd built over the past few hours. But when Eli got behind the wheel and I settled into the passenger seat, some of that intimacy returned. Maybe it was the enclosed space, or the fact that we were both tired enough to let our guards down completely. "This has been," I started, then stopped, not sure how to finish the sentence. "Yeah," Eli said softly, "it has been." We drove back toward the gas station in comfortable silence, both of us seeming to understand that words would only diminish what had happened between us. But as we pulled into the parking lot where my Honda sat waiting, unchanged and somehow disappointing after everything that had transpired, I felt the weight of impending goodbye settling over us. Eli parked next to my car but didn't get out immediately. We sat there in the patrol car, engine running, both of us looking straight ahead like we could delay the inevitable by not acknowledging it. "You'll probably forget about all this," Eli said finally, his voice so quiet I almost missed it. I turned to look at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "I don't think I will." "No?" "No. I think this is the kind of night that changes things, even if you don't know what those things are yet." Eli was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his profile serious in the morning light streaming through the windshield. "Then maybe," he said slowly, like he was testing the words as he spoke them, "maybe it meant something. Maybe it did. I should have gotten out of the car then. Should have thanked him for the coffee and the conversation and the reminder that interesting people existed in unexpected places. Should have gotten in my Honda and driven to that motel he'd recommended and tried to get a few hours of sleep before figuring out what came next in my life. But I didn't move, and neither did he. "Mark," he said after a while, Yeah? I'm glad you were driving through town tonight. Me too. I reached for the door handle, and this time I actually opened it. The morning air was cooler than I'd expected, crisp with the promise of autumn, even though it was still technically summer. I stood beside the patrol car for a moment, not quite ready to walk away, but not sure what else there was to say. Drive safe, Eli said, echoing his words from hours earlier. I will. I walked toward my car, keys in hand, but when I reached the driver's door, I turned around. Eli was still sitting in the patrol car, still watching me with that same patient expression he'd worn all night. Like he had all the time in the world, like he was in no hurry for this to end. Our eyes met across the parking lot, and in that moment I understood something I hadn't been able to articulate before. He hadn't given me a warning tonight, or a ticket, or even just a conversation to pass the time. He'd given me a night I didn't know I needed. A reminder that connection was possible, that loneliness wasn't permanent, that sometimes the most important encounters were the ones you never saw coming. I raised my hand in a small wave and he nodded back, and then I got in my car and started the engine. But as I pulled out of the gas station parking lot heading toward that motel and whatever version of normal life waited beyond it, I found myself smiling. Not because I knew what came next, but because for the first time in months I was curious to find out. In my rearview mirror, I could see Eli's patrol car growing smaller, but he hadn't moved yet. He was still there, still waiting, like he understood that some goodbyes needed time to settle before they became real. And maybe they did. Maybe some connections were strong enough to survive the transition from night to day, from stranger to memory, from chance encounter to something that mattered. Maybe some things were worth holding on to, even when you didn't know what they meant yet. As I drove toward the motel and the promise of sleep and whatever came after that, I found myself already missing the weight of Eli's presence beside me, the comfort of being seen and understood by someone who had no reason to care but somehow did anyway. I didn't know if I'd ever see him again. Didn't know if this was the beginning of something or just a beautiful interruption in the middle of a life that was still figuring itself out. But I knew I'd been changed by it, and for now, that felt like enough.